The 1960s were the golden age of American drag racing, a time when factory engineers worked weekends in secret shops, when winning on Sunday sold cars on Monday, and when the quarter mile was the only measure of automotive supremacy that mattered. This was before computers, before traction control, before safety became more important than speed. Just raw power, primitive tires, and drivers with more courage than sense. The cars that dominated those drag strips weren't just fast. They were purpose-built weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with steel, rubber, and American ingenuity. Today, we're counting down 12 best vintage drag race cars out of the 1960s. Number 12, the 1963 Pontiac Catalina Super Duty. Pontiac knew that winning races meant building cars that didn't make sense anywhere except the drag strip. The 1963 Catalina Super Duty was exactly that kind of insanity. This was a full-size sedan that weighed over 3,800 pounds. But Pontiac stuffed it full of their 421 cubic inch Super Duty V8, an engine that made well over 500 horsepower in race trim. The factory rating was 405 horses, but that was pure fiction designed to keep the insurance companies and NASCAR officials happy. Real dyno numbers showed output closer to 550, maybe more depending on how the engine was built. The Super Duty engine featured aluminum body components to save weight, special cylinder heads with massive ports, and a high-lift camshaft that made the engine sound like it was tearing itself apart at idle. The block itself was reinforced with additional webbing to handle the stress of sustained, high RPM operation. The connecting rods were forged steel instead of cast iron, and the pistons were specially designed to handle the extreme pressures of 11-to-1 compression ratios running on racing fuel. Only about a dozen of these cars were built, which made them rare even when new. But in the hands of drivers like Arnie Beswick and Royal Pontiac, the Catalina Super Duty dominated its class. It could run the quarter mile in the low 13s at over 110 miles per hour, which was astonishing for a car that size and weight. The key was power-to-weight ratio and gearing. Pontiac offered rear axle ratios so steep that the car was barely drivable on the street, but perfect for quarter-mile acceleration. Some racers ran 4.88 gears, which meant the engine was screaming at over 4,000 revolutions per minute just to maintain highway speeds. But at the drag strip, those gears meant the engine stayed in its power band through multiple gear changes, maximizing acceleration. The Super Duty Catalina proved that cubic inches and horsepower could overcome almost any weight disadvantage, and it established Pontiac as a serious performance brand at a time when they needed credibility with younger buyers. The success on the drag strip translated directly to showroom traffic, as enthusiasts wanted to own a piece of that racing glory. Number 11, the 1965 Plymouth Belvedere, a 990. Chrysler's factory drag racing program produced some of the wildest machines of the decade, and the 1965 Belvedere A990 was among the strangest. Plymouth took their mid-size Belvedere and stripped it of everything that didn't make it faster. The glass was replaced with lightweight plastic that was thinner and more brittle than regular automotive glass. The interior was gutted down to bare metal, with racing seats and minimal sound deadening. The front bumper was aluminum instead of chrome-plated steel. The fenders were fiberglass, molded to look like the steel originals, but weighing a fraction as much. Even the battery was relocated to the trunk to improve weight distribution. And under the hood sat the 426 cubic inch Hemi 5.8, making over 500 horsepower in its mildest tune. But the real innovation was the front suspension. Chrysler moved the entire front axle forward several inches to improve weight transfer during launches. That modification gave the car its distinctive long nose appearance and helped plant the rear tires more effectively when the driver dumped the clutch. The physics were simple. By moving weight forward, you increased the amount that transferred rearward during acceleration, which loaded the rear tires and improved traction. The A990 could run the quarter mile in the low 11s at over 125 miles per hour, which made it competitive with anything else in its class. Only about 50 were built, all of them sold directly to racers through special dealer programs. These weren't street cars that happened to be fast. They were race cars that barely qualified as street legal. The interiors were loud, uncomfortable, and hot. The engines idled so rough that parts would literally vibrate loose if you didn't safety wire everything. The solid lifter camshafts required valve adjustments every few hundred miles, and the lightweight construction meant the cars flexed and twisted under hard acceleration with doors that wouldn't close properly and body panels that never quite lined up. But none of that mattered when the lights turned green. The A990 was built to win races, and it did exactly that throughout 1965 and 66 before rule changes made it obsolete. The legacy of the A990 was significant. It proved that Chrysler was willing to build truly extreme machines to win races, and it established the Hemi as the dominant engine in drag racing for the rest of the decade. Number 10, the 1968 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. The Z28 Camaro is remembered today as a Trans Am Racing homologation special, but in 1968 it was also a formidable drag racer in the right hands. Chevrolet built the Z28 around their 302 cubic inch small block V8, which officially made 290 horsepower. But like all manufacturer ratings of the era, that number was conservative. Real output was closer to 400 horses with the right tuning. The 302 was created by combining the 4-inch bore of the 327 small block with the 3-inch stroke of the 283, resulting in an engine that could rev to 7,000 RPM without exploding. What made the Z28 special for drag racing was its weight distribution and balance. The small block engine was lighter than big block competitors, which meant less weight on the front axle and better traction at the rear. The suspension was tuned for handling, with stiffer springs and larger sway bars, but that also meant it could handle the violent weight transfer of hard launches without wheel hop or axle wrap. The multi-leaf rear springs were specifically calibrated to control axle rotation under power, which kept the rear tires planted instead of allowing them to spin uselessly. Racers quickly discovered that the Z28 responded well to modifications, bolt-on headers, which improved exhaust flow and reduced back pressure, and you'd gain 20 or 30 horsepower. Replace the stock carburetor with a larger Holley 4-barrel on an aluminum intake manifold, and you'd gain another 20 horses. Do some port work on the cylinder heads to improve airflow, and suddenly you had an engine making serious power. Add slicks and traction bars, and the Z28 could run in the low 13s at over 100 miles per hour. That wasn't competitive with the big block cars in pure acceleration, but in classes limited by engine displacement, the Z28 was a giant killer. It proved that Chevrolet's small block architecture was capable of competing with much larger engines, and it established the Z28 as a serious performance nameplate that would endure for decades. The Z28 also taught racers that handling mattered even in drag racing. A car that could launch straight and stay planted through the gears was faster than a more powerful car that spun its tires and wandered across lanes. Number 9, the 1962 Chevrolet Bel Air 409. Before the big block, Mark IV arrived, Chevrolet had the W Series engine, and the biggest version displaced 409 cubic inches. In 1962, Chevy stuffed this monster into full-size Bel Air sedans and created drag racing legends. The 409 made 420 horsepower in its hottest factory configuration, but racers could extract much more with the right modifications. The engine featured massive ports that could flow enormous amounts of air and fuel, solid lifters that allowed higher RPM operation, and dual 4-barrel carburetors that fed an insatiable appetite for fuel and air. The intake manifold was a work of art, a cross-ram design that used long runners to take advantage of intake pulse tuning effects, which improved power at specific engine speeds. The result was an engine that pulled like a freight train from 3,000 RPM all the way to redline. The Bel Air was heavy, over 3,600 pounds, but the 409's torque was enough to overwhelm the rear tires and send the car charging down the strip. Drivers like Dave Strickler became famous campaigning Bel Air 409s, running times in the mid-12s and winning match races across the country. Strickler's car, known as Old Reliable, became one of the most successful drag cars of the early 60s, winning races and setting records at tracks from coast to coast. The car's size was actually an advantage in some ways. The long wheelbase, 119 inches, helped keep the front end planted during launches, which prevented the violent wheel stands that plagued lighter cars with shorter wheelbases. And the heavy construction meant the chassis could handle the punishment of repeated hard launches without cracking or failing. The full-frame construction with its separate body and frame was more flexible than unibody designs but also more durable under the twisting forces of drag racing. The 409 Bel Air was a working-class drag racer. Not exotic, not particularly sophisticated, just brutally effective. It proved that you didn't need the latest technology or the most expensive components to win races. You just needed cubic inches, horsepower, and the guts to use them. The 409 also established Chevrolet's big block lineage that would continue through the Mark IV and into the rat motor era. Number 8, the 1967 Ford Fairlane Thunderbolt Heritage. Ford's factory drag racing efforts in the mid-60s produced some of the most successful cars of the era. While the original Thunderbolt was a 1964 model, racers continued to campaign updated versions through the late 60s. These cars featured Ford's 427 cubic inch side oiler V8, an engine designed from the ground up for high-performance use. The side oiler featured a unique oiling system that fed oil to the main bearings from the side of the block, rather than through passages in the crankshaft. This ensured that bearings always had adequate lubrication, even under sustained high RPM operation and high cornering loads. The result was an engine that could rev higher and live longer than competitors. The bottom end was bulletproof, with cross-bolted main bearing caps that prevented the crankshaft from walking or the block from cracking under stress. In race trim, the 427 could make over 500 horsepower, and modified versions with tunnel port heads and dual 4-barrel carburetors pushed 600 horses or more. The Fairlane body was lighter than full-size Ford sedans, which gave the car a better power-to-weight ratio. The midsize platform weighed around 3,500 pounds, which was manageable for the amount of power being produced. Ford also offered fiberglass body panels and lightweight glass to reduce weight further. The front fenders, hood, and doors could all be ordered in fiberglass, saving over 200 pounds. The combination of serious power and reduced weight meant the Fairlane could run the quarter mile in the low 11s at over 120 miles per hour. Ford's factory support for these programs was extensive. They provided special parts through their Autolite and Cobra Jet parts programs, technical support from engineers who worked directly with racers, and direct assistance to teams who campaigned their products. That level of factory involvement helped Ford dominate drag racing in the mid-60s and establish their performance credentials with a generation of buyers who grew up watching Fairlanes win races every weekend. Number 7, the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. The Daytona was built for NASCAR superspeedways, but its aerodynamic innovations made it surprisingly effective in drag racing applications as well. That massive nose cone, nearly 2 feet long and sharply pointed, and towering rear wing that stood over 2 feet above the trunk lid weren't just for show. They actually improved high-speed stability and reduced drag at speeds above 100 miles per hour. At the speeds achieved in quarter-mile racing, aerodynamics start to matter, and the Daytona's slippery shape gave it an advantage over boxier competitors. Wind tunnel testing showed that the Daytona had significantly less drag than a standard Charger, which translated to higher trap speeds at the end of the quarter mile. Under the hood, racers installed Chrysler's 440 cubic inch or 426 cubic inch Hemi engines, both of which could make well over 500 horsepower in race configuration. The 440 was the more common choice for street applications, with its wedge head design offering better low-end torque and easier tuning. But serious racers chose the Hemi for its superior top-end power and ability to rev higher. The Charger's unibody construction was stiffer than body-on-frame competitors, which helped maintain chassis rigidity under the twisting forces of hard acceleration. The wider rear track, 63 inches, also provided better traction by spreading the load across more tire contact patch. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, but Chrysler had refined the geometry to minimize wheel hop and axle wrap. Daytona drag racers could run in the low 11s at over 125 miles per hour, which was competitive with purpose-built drag cars that cost much more. The car's rarity, only about 500 were built for NASCAR homologation, made it a collector's item even when new. Today, original Daytonas are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, but in 1969, they were just wild-looking race cars that proved aerodynamics mattered, even in straight-line acceleration. The Daytona's success also influenced later drag car design, with builders paying more attention to frontal area, body shape, and high-speed stability. Number 6, the 1964 Ford Galaxie Lightweight. Ford's lightweight program created some of the most successful drag racers of the mid-60s. The 1964 Galaxie lightweight featured fiberglass fenders, doors, and hood that were molded to look identical to the steel versions, but weighed a fraction as much. The bumpers were aluminum instead of chrome-plated steel. The windows were thin plexiglass that scratched easily and yellowed over time, but saved crucial pounds. Even the seats were replaced with lightweight buckets, and the back seat was removed entirely. The result was a full-size sedan that weighed hundreds of pounds less than stock. Some examples tipped the scales at under 3,600 pounds, which was remarkable for a car that size. Under that fiberglass hood sat Ford's 427 cubic inch V8, making over 425 horsepower in street trim and much more in race configuration. The high-riser version of the 427 featured taller intake ports and a specially designed intake manifold that improved top-end power. With dual 4-barrel carburetors and open headers, race-prepped 427s could make over 500 horsepower. The Galaxie's long wheelbase, 119 inches, and heavy-duty suspension made it stable at high speeds, and the weight reduction meant it could accelerate like cars half its size. Racers like Gas Ronda and Les Ritchie became famous campaigning lightweight Galaxies, running times in the low 12s and winning races across the country. Ronda's car in particular became legendary for its consistency. It could run the same elapsed time within a tenth of a second, pass after pass, which was crucial for winning races in an era before electronic timing and staging systems. The lightweight program wasn't just about removing weight, though. Ford also strengthened critical chassis components to handle the stress of drag racing. The rear axle was beefed up with stronger gears and a limited slip differential. The transmission was upgraded with hardened gears and better synchronizers, and the cooling system was improved to handle the heat of repeated hard runs. The attention to detail paid off. The Galaxie lightweight was one of the most successful drag racers of 1964, and it helped establish Ford's performance reputation during a critical period when younger buyers were starting to view American cars as boring and outdated compared to European sports cars. Number 5. The 1968 Plymouth Barracuda Superstock. Plymouth's Barracuda had been a compact, sporty car since its introduction in 1964, but by 1968, the Superstock versions were serious drag racing weapons. Plymouth offered the Barracuda with the 426 cubic inch Hemi 5.8, creating a pony car with muscle car power. The combination of relatively lightweight, around 3,200 pounds, with all the lightweight options, and massive horsepower, made the Hemi Barracuda a terror on the drag strip. It could run the quarter mile in the low 11s, at over 120 miles per hour, which was competitive with anything in its class. The short wheelbase of 108 inches meant weight transfer was dramatic during launches, which helped plant the rear tires, but also made the car prone to wheel stands if the suspension wasn't set up correctly. Racers learned to tune the front suspension to control launch angles, using adjustable shocks that could be softened to allow more front-end lift, or stiffened to keep the car planted. Traction bars, steel bars that connected the rear axle to the frame, prevented axle wrap, and controlled how much the suspension compressed under power. The Hemi engine's power delivery was all or nothing. Docile below 3,000 revolutions per minute, violent above it. The dual 4-barrel carburetors sat on a cross-ram intake manifold that was tuned for top-end power, which meant the engine made most of its horsepower between 4,000 and 6,000 RPM. That narrow power band required precise shifting and careful clutch work to keep the engine in its sweet spot. Miss a shift or let the RPM drop too low, and you'd fall out of the power band and lose momentum. But get it right, and the Hemi Barracuda was virtually unbeatable. The car's compact dimensions also made it easier to transport to races on open trailers, and the unibody construction meant less weight than body-on-frame competitors. Plymouth's factory support for Superstock racing ensured that parts were available through the Direct Connection Performance Parts program, and technical assistance was just a phone call away. Factory engineers would often attend major races to provide tuning advice and troubleshoot problems, which gave Plymouth racers a significant advantage over competitors who were working without factory support. Number 4. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro, COPO. The COPO Camaro represents one of the cleverest end runs around corporate policy in automotive history. Chevrolet's official stance was that no engine larger than 400 cubic inches could be installed in the Camaro. This policy was driven by insurance concerns and corporate desire to position the Camaro as a sporty car rather than a muscle car. But savvy dealers discovered that by using the central office production order system, a mechanism designed for fleet sales and special conversions, they could order Camaros with the 427 cubic inch L72 V8 from the Corvette. The result was a pony car with big block muscle car power. The COPO Camaro could run the quarter mile in the low 13s at over 110 miles per hour in stock form, and modified versions were even faster. The 427 made 425 horsepower officially, but real output was closer to 450 horses. The solid lifter cam, high-flow cylinder heads, and aluminum intake manifold were designed for performance, not economy or emissions. The Camaro's relatively light weight, around 3,400 pounds, gave it a power-to-weight ratio that embarrassed cars with bigger engines. The handling was also surprisingly good for a drag car. The Camaro's chassis was designed to handle road racing and Trans Am competition, and that meant it could manage the weight transfer of hard launches without the wheel hop and axle wrap that plagued other cars. The multi-leaf rear springs were stiff enough to control axle rotation but compliant enough to maintain tire contact. Racers discovered that the COPO Camaro was a well-balanced platform that responded well to modifications. Add headers to reduce exhaust back pressure, and you'd gain 15 to 20 horsepower. Upgrade the carburetor from the stock Holly to a larger unit with better flow, and you'd gain another 10 horses. Swap in stiffer rear springs and add traction bars to control wheel hop, and suddenly you had a car capable of running in the 12s or better. The COPO program also produced Camaros with the all-aluminum ZL 1427, an exotic engine that made well over 500 horsepower, but cost as much as a small house. Only 69 ZL1 Camaros were built, making them among the rarest and most valuable muscle cars ever produced. These ultra-rare ZL1 Camaros could run in the 11s and were some of the fastest production-based cars of the decade. The aluminum block saved nearly 100 pounds compared to the cast-iron L72, which improved weight distribution and handling while also reducing overall vehicle weight. Number 3. The 1964 Dodge 440 Stage 3. Dodge's commitment to drag racing in the mid-60s produced some of the most extreme factory race cars ever built. The Stage 3 package for the 440 cubic inch V8 turned the already potent engine into an absolute monster. Stage 3 engines featured high-compression pistons that raised the compression ratio to over 12-to-1, radical camshafts with duration specs that would make modern race engines jealous, race-spec valve springs that could handle the stress of 7,000 RPM operation, and dual 4-barrel carburetors sitting on a ram induction manifold. The ram induction system used long intake runners that were tuned to create pressure waves that helped to pack more air and fuel into the cylinders at specific engine speeds. The result was over 500 horsepower in an engine that was technically street legal, but barely civilized enough to drive on public roads. The idle was so rough that the car shook violently at stoplights, and the power delivery was so aggressive that wheel spin was virtually guaranteed on anything except perfectly prepared drag strip surfaces. Dodge installed these engines in lightened B-body cars, Polaris and custom models, that had been stripped of every unnecessary pound. Sound deadening was removed. The heater was deleted. The radio was gone. Even the passenger seat was often removed to save weight. The combination of massive power and reduced weight created cars that could run the quarter mile in the low 11s at speeds exceeding 125 miles per hour. The Stage 3 package was expensive. It added over $1,000 to the base price of the car, which was significant money in 1964, which meant only serious racers bought them. These weren't weekend warriors or street racers. These were professional drag racers or wealthy enthusiasts who wanted the absolute fastest car money could buy. The engines required constant maintenance and tuning. The radical cam profiles meant rough idle and poor low-speed drivability. The valve lash had to be adjusted every few hundred miles to maintain proper clearances. The high compression demanded racing fuel with octane ratings well above what was available at regular gas stations. And the stress of repeated wide-open throttle runs meant frequent rebuilds. Pistons would crack, connecting rods would bend, and valve springs would break after sustained abuse. But for those willing to accept the compromises, the Stage 3 Dodge was one of the fastest cars available in 1964. It proved that Dodge was serious about performance and willing to build cars that pushed every boundary of what was acceptable in a production vehicle. Number 2. the 1968 Hurst Hemi Underglass. Some drag cars transcended racing and became cultural icons. The Hurst Hemi Underglass was one of those machines. This was a Plymouth Barracuda that had been radically modified to place the 426 cubic inch Hemi engine in the rear, behind the driver. The Underglass name came from the fact that the engine sat under a plexiglass rear window that had been enlarged to accommodate the massive power plant. The weight distribution was reversed from a normal car, heavy in the rear, light in the front. That meant the car could launch so hard that the front wheels would come off the ground and stay there for the first 100 feet or more. The wheel stands became the car's signature, and crowds packed drag strips to watch driver Bob Riggle pilot the Underglass on its rear wheels down the quarter mile. The engineering required to make this work was sophisticated. The front suspension had to be stiffened dramatically to prevent the car from flipping over backwards when it launched. Heavy-duty coil springs and shock absorbers that would be at home on a truck were installed to control the front end's motion. The wheelie bars, steel tubes extending behind the rear axle, had to be precisely positioned to catch the car at the right angle. Too short, and the car would flip backwards. Too long, and they'd drag on the ground and slow the car down. The adjustment was critical and varied depending on track conditions and how aggressively the driver wanted to launch. And the driver had to modulate the throttle carefully to control the angle of the wheel stand without losing forward momentum. Too much throttle and the car would go vertical. Too little and the front end would drop, which would cause the car to porpoise up and down as weight transferred back and forth. The transmission had to be specially modified to handle the unique stresses of mid-engine mounting, with custom drive shafts and U-joints that could handle the angles and loads involved. The Hemi Underglass wasn't the fastest car of the era, but it was certainly the most spectacular. It ran the quarter mile in the low 11s when it wasn't showing off, but the real performance was the show. The Underglass became a touring attraction, appearing at drag strips across the country and helping popularize drag racing with mainstream audiences who might never have attended a race otherwise. It appeared at national events, match races, and even car shows, where crowds would line up to see the car and meet the driver. The success of the Underglass spawned imitators and inspired other exhibition cars that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with creative engineering and fearless driving. Number 1, the 1969 Plymouth Hemi Barracuda Superstock. At the top of our list sits the ultimate expression of 1960s drag racing excess, the 1969 Hemi Barracuda Superstock. This was Plymouth's final answer to everyone who said you couldn't fit a Hemi in a compact car. They proved you could, and the result was devastating. The 426 cubic inch Hemi made over 500 horsepower in race trim, installed in a car that weighed barely 3,200 pounds with all the lightweight options installed. The power-to-weight ratio was better than anything else available, and the results spoke for themselves. The Hemi Barracuda could run the quarter mile in the low 10s at over 130 miles per hour. Those were times that would have been considered impossible just a few years earlier, times that would still be respectable in modern drag racing. The car dominated superstock racing in 1969 and 70, winning national championships and setting records that stood for years. Drivers like Butch Leal and Sox and Martin became legends campaigning Hemi Barracudas, winning races from coast to coast and establishing Plymouth as the dominant force in factory-backed drag racing. What made the Hemi Barracuda truly special was how it represented the culmination of everything Detroit learned about drag racing in the 60s. The engine was bulletproof, 4-bolt cross-bolted main bearing caps, forged connecting rods that could handle the stress of 8,000 RPM operation, forged pistons with special coatings to resist scuffing, and components designed to withstand abuse that would destroy lesser motors. The cylinder heads featured massive ports that could flow over 300 cubic feet per minute, and the valves were titanium to reduce reciprocating weight. The chassis was carefully engineered with the right suspension geometry to maximize traction without making the car unstable. The rear leaf springs were carefully calibrated to control axle wrap, while still allowing enough movement to keep the tires planted. The front suspension was stiffened to control weight transfer and prevent excessive front-end lift. The weight distribution was optimized by placing the battery in the trunk and removing every unnecessary pound from the front of the car. Fiberglass fenders and hood saved over 100 pounds. Aluminum intake manifolds and headers reduced weight while improving performance. Even the bumpers were aluminum instead of chrome-plated steel, and the transmission and rear axle were purpose-built to handle the shock loads of repeated wide-open throttle launches. The 4-speed manual transmission featured specially hardened gears and synchronizers, and the clutch was a dual-disc racing unit that could handle over 600 pound-feet of torque. The rear axle had a limited slip differential with hardened gears and a special lubricant that could handle the heat of repeated hard launches. The Hemi Barracuda wasn't streetable in any meaningful sense. The engine idled so rough that it shook the entire car violently enough to crack windshields and loosen trim pieces. The clutch was heavy enough to require 2 feet to operate, and the engagement was so abrupt that smooth starts were virtually impossible. The fuel consumption was measured in gallons per mile rather than miles per gallon. A full throttle pass down the quarter mile could consume half a gallon of racing fuel, and the noise was loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage without protection. The straight-through exhaust pipes had no mufflers, just open headers that directed exhaust straight out from under the car. At full throttle, the sound was over 140 decibels, louder than a jet engine at takeoff. But none of that mattered. This was a pure race car that happened to have VIN numbers and door handles. It represented the absolute peak of factory drag racing before new rules and regulations forced manufacturers to back away from all-out competition. The Clean Air Act and insurance industry pressure would soon make cars like this impossible to build and sell. Only 55 Hemi Barracudas were built in 1969, which made them rare and valuable even when new. Plymouth sold them through select dealerships to known racers, and the waiting list was long. Today they're worth 7 figures, preserved in collections or still campaigned by dedicated racers who appreciate what these machines represent. The Hemi Barracuda was the fastest, most extreme, most uncompromising drag racer of the 1960s, and it earned its place at the top of this list through sheer performance dominance and the legacy it left behind. These 12 machines represented the absolute cutting edge of drag racing technology in the 1960s. They were built in an era when manufacturers competed directly for supremacy on the drag strip, when winning races translated to showroom sales, and when factory support meant real engineering assistance and special parts. The drivers who campaigned these cars were heroes to a generation of enthusiasts who followed their exploits in magazines like Hot Rod and Carcraft and at local tracks every weekend. The mechanics who kept these temperamental beasts running were artists who understood that speed required both science and intuition, who could tune carburetors by ear and set ignition timing by feel. And the engineers who designed them pushed boundaries, broke rules, and created machines that remain legendary more than half a century later. These weren't just race cars. They were symbols of American ingenuity, excess, and the belief that if something was worth doing, it was worth overdoing. The 1960s drag racing scene was raw and dangerous, with minimal safety equipment and tracks that were often poorly prepared. Drivers competed without roll cages, without fire suits, sometimes without even helmets. The risks were real, and fatal accidents happened with tragic regularity. But that danger was part of the appeal, part of what made the sport exciting and the victories meaningful. These cars and the men who drove them represented a breed of racer that may never exist again. Fearless, skilled, and willing to risk everything for the chance to be fastest. Which of these 60s drag racing legends would you most want to experience at full throttle? Drop your choice in the comments below. And if you love stories from the golden age of quarter-mile warfare, hit that subscribe button for more tales of the cars, the racers, and the glory days when drag racing was America's wildest motorsport.